Okay, so here's a story about how I'm not a monk. I received a question, how am I not a monk? And I appreciate the question. Um, I'm not a monk because when I was a young man, I followed a Benedictine tradition, which is that ancient monastics would allow young men to join their community to renew the amount of people in the community. As the old died, the younger people had to take over and run the monastery. So when I was a young man, I joined a Benedictine monastery at the age of 13 to 14, 15, 16. So end of 13th year, so for 3 years. And then after that, I went back to my hometown, and I worked for 7 months in a farm so I could pay to go to another place. I went down to a Benedictine monastery as well in another tradition. So I went to a few traditions, one with the Vatican traditions, one with the Vatican breakoff, which was a traditional Latin rite, who try to maintain alignment with the Pope, but have some political disputes about the tradition because they want to maintain ancient traditions. I also traveled to Australia and lived with the SSPX there, Society St. Pius X there, for 2 years. And during those 5 years from the age of 13 to 19, I met basically Vatican members like Cardinal. I met the bishops of Canada. I met many monks. I met a monks of a traditional variety in USA, traveled to their mission in Mexico. I lived in Australia, and met like the leader of the SSPX, who confirmed me, and I took the first step basically of the ego sum without becoming a priest. I think it's called acolyte, but the ancient tradition is like I cannot be an acolyte without becoming a priest. If you become an acolyte, then the ancient tradition is that acolyte is the step toward the priesthood, actually, one of the steps toward the priesthood. Whereas the current tradition of the Vatican is they kind of separated that. That's only true, I think, inside the Vatican, is if I know the meaning or in groups that do that. But I think nowadays they have altar servers and things like that. So rather than steps toward the priesthood, like recruitment. A change in system is just because I guess the world's changed as well, globalism and such. I don't know, but I don't know those answers because I haven't practiced since 19. I would say that I'm anthropologically connected to them. That was relevant. My puberty, my youth, from 13 to 19 was basically celibate, chaste. My standards. Although I never practiced after that because I'm anthropologically connected, but not socially connected. Was something like, the way I knew the world didn't change really, in terms of some of my innate assumptions are the same, But nonetheless, I don't really go to church or practice. Okay, so how am I not a monk? When I left the monastery, I decided to join the Society of St. Pius X. That's why I'm not a monk. My colleagues or my peers, my classmates stayed, and ended up staying for life. Some of them, and other ones left. I think they're a very wealthy monastery where I was at. They gave me more than I would have gotten. I got to exercise, I got to lose weight, I got really comfortable, I got well nourished. I got to exercise a lot in the barns because I worked out a lot while also working in the farm. And so, I did a lot of work in silage, manure moving, and tons of farm labor, planting, crops, projects, and all sorts of stuff, tree orchard, caring, and things like that. Tons of sports, and I learned lots of skills. Learned about the radio, learned how to use ham radio, and did lots of awesome stuff, science projects. But how I did not become a monk is that I decided to leave. In terms of the question about how I decided how I'm not a monk, I think the relevant part is the Carnivore, because that's where I got the question from. So monks eat 3 meals a day often, and I would say usually they eat 3 meals a day. If you go back to the ancient tradition before Benedict of Nursia, you get a lot of hermits and things like that, or different kinds of monks. And Benedict was a person who believed in the monks should live together and eat together and stuff like that. And as did the Desert Fathers, because the Desert Fathers there were many kinds of monks to the Desert Fathers, but what the Desert Fathers were doing is that they were kind of observing different kinds of monks, and they were saying, that kind of person, they eat a food and they don't do okay, they're not feeling good, and the other one, they eat the same food and they feel good. So this one should benefit, and the other one should not take this, but should benefit in another way, find something else to benefit from. So a lot of early economics of food, from the Desert Fathers, you can kind of see how people can think about the root of what it means that ancients can learn how to eat, and do things. And Benedict of Nursia thought that people should eat together because he thought they should work together, they should do things together. They were communities, they lived together, they don't leave, they took a vow of stability, and they stayed together. And so, they ran farms. They learned how to protect the treasures of the world, Catholic treasures and such, throughout wars and all sorts of events, and throughout their history up to the present day. And so when you look at their food traditions as they handed it on, you would see a really modern tradition where they learn to eat in a way and they continue to communicate about what they mean about the well-being. So if you eat this and you're doing okay, then that's okay. And if you're not doing okay, then you should, you should adjust the intake and that kind of thing. So it was a kind of a natural method. I mean, the ancient method was that something like, you have a certain amount of food to eat, but they tend to model a spiritual tradition. And yes, they use medicine, and yes, they do all that. But in terms of they know how to use food science and things like that. They know how to talk to nutritionalists or doctors. They know how to study themselves. Many of them are scientists in that way. So the point would be something like when you do things about monks, they tend to do things in the same way together and without special dispensation or agreement in order to maintain a community spirit and model. And they're careful, well thought out, and that kind of thing. So I'm using a kind of model which is not the same. I don't eat the same foods. So it looks like fasting, like a spiritual fast, but it's not. What I'm doing is a science modality, and that's why it's not the same. So religious people are doing things in the spirit of Jesus together, okay? Catholic religious are concerned about spirit of Jesus. They're concerned about God. What's important about their community is Jesus. So and so when they're doing this thing together, they're kind of harmonizing, I suppose, or balancing, or learning together and learning agreement and all that. But me, what I'm doing is I studied carefully a modality of science, ketogenic and carnivore, and then I kind of cut out over a few years all of the bad things, and I kept the good things that I wanted, such as animal products. And then, I learned during that time how to not eat for a day, 2 days, a week, 2 weeks, and do that regularly. So that became easy. And that's not a spiritual tradition. That to me is genetic. I followed an ancestral tradition, a model about, before farming, when hunters ate. Why did their genetics develop? Because they ate meat. Because they ate the entire animal. What does it mean that they were successful or healthy, or that they had to learn what they could or could not eat about an animal, And because of the way they ate, that is the tradition. I ate based on a genetic tradition, not based on, a social anthropological tradition that is more than we can understand what our ancestors ate, because we know they didn't have things or had things, and we can understand what they did. So it's not the same as a current or modern custom, okay? And that's not the same as a spiritual tradition. But to me, it's an ancestral tradition. I acknowledge my ancestors genetically, and that's why I eat this way. So I think whereas monastics would honor Benedict Nursia's tradition, the rule, for example, because they're Benedictines, if they're Benedictines, plus, their tradition as they have handed it down from century to century to century through their main family line, and then how they arrive together, and now they do this together. That would be the way they fast. Whereas me, I fast through the scientific genetic modality about ancestral hunting. I'm a hunter modality. Whereas keto is also a wonderful modality, but a partner or family or neighbor to the hunter. And And I want pre-settlement food method. I want a food method that wasn't being farmed because they were dying of cavities. Ancestrally speaking, anthropologically speaking, people were dying of cavities a long time ago, millennia ago, because they were eating grain. No, they didn't escape it. They died bad deaths because they had grain. And so for me, it's like, well, not everybody died, but the hunters were like, not getting those results because they weren't doing those things. And so I want the hunter tradition, for example. That is a kind of claim that isn't the same as the evidence that somebody died of cavities, thousands of years ago. But for me, it was something like before farming, before settlements, get before those cities, okay? And that's the diet that I want to see, okay? So whereas monastic traditions are going to go back to the time of Jesus, possibly 1,000 years before that, because there were monks waiting for those moments, for those for their they were in wait, I guess. I don't know the verbiage for it, but basically we understand that there are traditions that started before the time of Christ. So and so that would be based on it being before the time of Christ, it would be something like around the time of Christ. Anthropologically, these societies and communities joined together eventually over time, formed the church as we know it, the world, Christian world as we know it, because of their journeys, what they carried to each other, what they learned to agree or keep, and that kind of thing. I hope that's helpful for you. So if I don't eat for 2 weeks, I don't necessarily think that's a religious tradition. I don't necessarily think that should be attempted by a religious person unless they've done this through medical modalities, or and even the medical modalities would say you have to watch each other, make sure you're okay and stuff like that. Also, there's a lot to know about genetics and the mind, the body. And so a lot of it has to do with nutrition. I mean, fasting doesn't mean I don't eat. It just means I don't eat food that has carbohydrates. And I eat supplementation because I'm a supplemental carnivore. If I take 2 weeks off food, I'm supplementing. And that's really what. Okay, so that's a science modality. It's easy because I'm nourished and I know what craving causes what craving. I mean, what cravings for what and what food I need, when and why, and that's not the same thing at all. So I hope that helps you. I hope I answered your question. Why I'm not a monk, and I would encourage religious communities to understand that this is not the perfection of their way of life, but if they were to use it, it would be very valuable to them and their personal day that they can't carry out the work for their mission. Basically, also it is a social tradition, not but it was a kind of person who was like, don't be singular, stay in the group, that kind of thing. So there's a certain amount of, they want to be healthy and well together, and they're ready and prepared, and they're studying, they know the science, but they're of their tradition, they're of their community mind. And then if I think of that kind of commitment or matching, then you could see a systemic change over 100 or 200 years. But I don't think that monks would necessarily do this unless that was natural to them. And the reason why I'm enforcing, like saying that over and over again, is that like it's not natural for people to do that without adjusting over life. Okay, so I definitely do fast more as if I knew monks or priests and things like that. But that isn't a spiritual thing to me. That's just a science modality, and it's a preference. I don't feel like I'm missing out. I don't want to eat those foods. That isn't like penance for me. That's like I got to drink my amino acids, right? This is water with electrolytes and amino acids, and I absolutely love it. So, I'm not missing out on anything there. Okay. I hope you're having a wonderful day. Take care, and I hope you have a good future. Take care.